In 911, the French ruler Charles the Simple allowed a group of Vikings to settle in Normandy as part of the Treaty of St. Clair in exchange for the land the Norsemen under Rollo were expected to provide protection along the coast against further Viking invaders. This settlement proved successful, and the Vikings in the region became known as the Norsemen, from which Normandy and Normans are derived. The Normans quickly adopted the indigenous culture of the French, renouncing paganism and converting to Christianity. They adopted the language of their new home and added features from their own Norse language, transforming it into the Norman language. They intermarried with the local populace and used the territory granted to them as a base to extend the frontiers of the duchy westward, annexing several territories around them. In 1002, the English king Ethelred the Unready married Emma of Normandy, the sister of Richard II, the Duke of Normandy. Their son, Edward the Confessor, succeeded to the English throne in 1042. This led to the establishment of a powerful Norman interest in English politics, as Edward drew heavily on his former hosts for support, bringing in Norman courtiers, soldiers, and clerks, and appointing them to positions of power, particularly in the church, though he was left childless and embroiled with conflict with the formidable Godwin, Earl of Wessex, and his sons. When King Edward died at the beginning of 1066, the lack of a clear heir led to a disputed succession in which several contenders laid claim to the throne of England. Edward's immediate successor was the Earl of Wessex, Harald Godwinson, the richest and most powerful of the English aristocrats. Harald was elected king by the Council of England and crowned by the Archbishop of York. Harald was immediately challenged by two powerful ruling neighbors. Duke William claimed that he had been promised the throne by King Edward and that Harald had sworn agreement to this. King Harald III of Norway, commonly known as Harald Hardrada, also contested the succession. This claim to the throne was based on an agreement between his predecessor, Magnus the Good, and the earlier English king, whereby if either died without an heir, the other would inherit both England and Norway. William and Harald at once set about assembling troops and ships to invade England. The Norwegians assembled a fleet of 300 ships to invade England, and it was said that Hardrada had over 200 ships, apart from supply ships and smaller craft, combined with reinforcements picked up at Orkney. The Norwegian army most likely numbered between 7,000 and 9,000 men. Arriving off the English coast in September, Hardrada was joined by further English forces recruited in Flanders and Scotland by Tostig Godwinson. Tostig was at odds with his elder brother, Harald, who had been elected king on Edward's death. Having been ousted from his position as Earl of Northumberland and exiled in 1065, Tostig had mounted a series of abortive attacks on England in the spring of 1066. The invaders sailed up the Humber River before advancing on York. On September 20th, they defeated a northern English army led by Edwin, the Earl of Mercia, at the Battle of Fulford, outside York. Following this victory, they received the surrender of York. Having briefly occupied the city and taken hostages and supplies from the city, they returned to their ships in recall. They offered peace to the Northumberlands in exchange for support for Hardrada's bid for the throne, and demanded further hostages for the whole of Yorkshire. At this time, King Harald was in southern England, anticipating an invasion from France by William, the Duke of Normandy. Learning of the Norwegian invasion, he headed north at great speed, traveling day and night. He made the journey from London to Yorkshire in only 4 days, enabling him to take the Norwegians completely by surprise. Having learned that the Northumberlands had been ordered to send the additional hostages and supplies to the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge, Harald hurried on through York to attack them at their rendezvous on September 25th. Until the English army came into view, the invaders remained unaware of the presence of any hostile army anywhere in the vicinity. The sudden appearance of the English army caught the Norwegians by surprise. The English advance was then delayed by the need to pass through the choke point presented by the bridge itself. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle has it that a giant Norse axeman blocked the narrow crossing and single-handedly held up the entire English army. The story is that the axeman was cut down up to 40 Englishmen and was only defeated when the English floated under the bridge in a half-barrel and thrust a spear through the planks, mortally wounding the axeman. This delay had allowed the bulk of the Norse army to form a shield wall to face the English attack. Harald's army poured across the bridge, forming a line just short of the Norse army. locked shields, and charged. The English offensive was soon counterattacked by the Vikings, led by Hardrada, that almost turned the battle in their favor. Hardrada, however, was killed by an arrow in the throat. In response, Harald offered his brother peace, but Tostig fought on, encouraged by the arrival of Viking reinforcements from the troops who had been guarding the ships at Recall, led by Ori, Hardrada's prospective son-in-law. Some of these men were said to have collapsed and died of exhaustion upon reaching the battlefield. The remainder were fully armored, and their counterattack briefly checked the English advance, but was soon overwhelmed, and Ori was slain along with Tostig. The battle went far beyond the bridge itself, and although it raged for hours, the Norse army's decision to leave their armor behind left them at a distinct disadvantage. Eventually, the Norse army began to fragment and fracture, allowing the English troops to force their way in and break up the Scandinavian shield wall. Completely outflanked, the Norwegian army was routed and pursued by the English army. King Harald accepted a truce with the surviving Norwegians on the terms that they were allowed to leave after giving pledges to not attack England again. The losses the Norwegians had suffered were so severe that only 24 ships from the fleet of over 300 were needed to carry the survivors away. They withdrew to Orkney and eventually back to Norway. Harald's victory, however, was short-lived. Only 3 days after the battle, on September 28th, a second invasion led by William, the Duke of Normandy, landed in Sussex on the south coast of England. Harald had to immediately turn his troops around and force march them southwards to intercept the Norman army. Less than 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, on October 14, 1066, the English army would meet the Normans at the Battle of Hastings. Thank you for watching our video on part 1 of the Norman conquest of England. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing. As always, thank you for watching The Knowledge Show.